Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're going to start this webinar in about 60 seconds, just as we allow more people to join us. So thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We are speaking on using your self-directed IRA as a way to invest in commercial real estate and real estate in general. Today, we're going to be joined by Brittany Melville. Brittany's from Next Generation Trust Company. Brittany applies her extensive experience in direct sales, marketing, customer relationship management at Next Generation. In her role, she develops and oversees the implementation of their marketing strategy across all media and works with your team to support sales initiatives. One of the best things we enjoy about Next Generation Trust Company is their focus on customer service and educating people on how to use their self-directed retirement account to make investments that fit their needs. So with that, Brittany, say hello, welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me, Spencer. I appreciate the opportunity to share some interesting education today with the audience.
Well, we're so happy to have you. You know, one of the things I love most about using your self-directed retirement account to invest in real estate or anything else is that it grows tax-free, and who doesn't want to grow their wealth and legacy without paying taxes on it? So we're so excited to have you. We love what you're doing over there at Next Generation Trust Company, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So if you want to just share your screen, we can just dive right into the presentation here.
Sure. Let me know if you're able to see it on your end, and then we can
Yeah,
get
we
started.
are. Yeah, we are.
Okay, perfect. Okay. So today we're going to talk about, as Spencer mentioned, a unique vehicle that you can use for commercial real estate investments and other real estate investments in general, and even other types of investments that aren't publicly traded. So we'll talk about self-directed IRAs. What are they? How do they work? What are some of the benefits of using one? What are some of the rules that you need to be aware of if you are considering this strategy? And then I'm sure we'll also have some time for questions later in the session. So just as it relates—
Real quick, Brittany, which reminds me, if you do have questions, please use the Q&A feature down below. And it's our goal to get to as many questions as we possibly can. So we hope to hear from you, and we want to dive deep into the questions you have.
Sounds good. So as it relates to self-directed IRAs, Next Generation's role is to act as custodian and administrator of these retirement accounts. So that just means that we hold the accounts and title to any of the investments that are held within these IRAs. We also do all of the necessary tax reporting that's required to the IRS, just as you would if you had other types of IRAs or IRAs that you have with other institutions. We do all the record keeping, provide, like we're doing today, provide education and ongoing service and support around different investment options and the guidelines that drive them. So we do all of that, and we are located primarily in Northern New Jersey, where the service office is based. We are a chartered trust company, which enables us to act as a custodian. And the trust company is chartered in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And that just so happens to be because South Dakota has a lot of favorable regulations when it comes to oversight of trust companies and understanding of the self-directed IRA industry. But it doesn't mean that we can't provide service to anyone anywhere with an IRA. So in any state and even globally, if you qualify for an IRA. Just a quick disclaimer that although we are in the financial services space, we are not fiduciaries. We're more of a neutral third party. So we don't sell investment products or provide any financial advice. That just means that if you are choosing a self-directed IRA and you're choosing your own investments, that you do your due diligence and that you feel comfortable assuming any risk that's associated with those investments. And obviously today's information is for educational purposes only and not as an endorsement of any particular investment. So, okay, let's get into the good stuff. So what is a self-directed IRA? So it functions just like a regular IRA that you might have, for example, at Fidelity or Schwab, other than the fact that it allows you to invest in things that are not publicly traded. So it's going to open up the options for you to invest in things like real estate, in private equity, to do lending, other types of assets. If you think of just about anything that's not publicly traded on the stock market, it can probably be held in a self-directed IRA. But historically, we've sort of been marketed to in a way to think that our options have always been restricted to stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. So this strategy has actually been around since the 1970s. Since the inception of the IRA, it's been allowed. So it's actually not a new allowed strategy. It's just something that still has not as much awareness on it as the traditional way of thinking about investing. So of course, investing in these non-publicly traded, what we call alternative assets, it provides several benefits. If held within an IRA, of course, right? There's the tax benefit. So if you were to invest in real estate with your personal funds, any of your earnings would be subject to tax. If you invest through a self-directed IRA, your earnings go back into the retirement account once you generated a return, and they will either be tax deferred or tax free, depending on the type of IRA that you have. So that's a pretty powerful tool. And additionally, it's a good hedge against market volatility, right? So we've seen, especially over the last year, we've seen lots of ups and downs, and we don't really have a lot of control over that when we invest in the stock market. So we work hard, we earn the money we put away, and we invest, but then we don't always have a lot of control over what happens to it. But of course, we're just as much impacted by that. So this is another way to diversify beyond stocks and bonds, and then to provide potentially more stable returns over a long-term period, which is what we tend to see in alternative assets versus public securities. So that's essentially what makes these a little bit different, is the types of assets that can be held, and then the sort of diversification, hedge against volatility, also having a little bit more control on your return on investment. So if you know in a commercial real estate deal, for example, you get a double-digit return, and in the market you're getting single-digit returns, and it's kind of a no-brainer to think about, is this something that I could potentially add to my portfolio?
Hey, Brittany, one thing I really like about what the SDIRA offers is it allows you to leverage your own strengths, right? So if you have, excuse me, if you have a competency for real estate, it allows you to do that. Vacant land, rentals, commercial, and even commodities, right? You could use it to invest in commodities. You can use it to invest in gold. Correct me if I'm wrong, right?
Correct.
Gold, even racehorses, right? So if you have whatever your competency is, wherever your skill set is, it allows you to kind of leverage that and use it to your, to your benefit as, for your retirement years.
Exactly. Yeah, we'd like to say that SDIRAs are a perfect fit for people to invest in the things that they know and understand.
Yeah.
So if you have existing experience in real estate investing and you're very comfortable, doing your evaluating deals and deciding what you feel is going to be a good investment for you, then this is just simply a matter of applying that same process to a tax advantage vehicle.
Yeah.
So the types of accounts that can be self-directed, these may vary depending on which custodian you decide to use, but typically you're going to see that all of these are options. The traditional tax-deferred IRA, which is going to have your funds go in pre-tax, and then your earnings get withdrawn later and are taxed at ordinary income tax at that time, once you reach your retirement age. The Roth IRA is a very powerful tool because it takes after-tax dollars, meaning that typically if you're putting money in a Roth, you can't deduct it because it should be already taxed. And then that grows tax-free. So you're only technically paying tax on what goes in up front, but you never pay tax on what you earn on top of that additional initial funding. So those earnings can be withdrawn at the qualified retirement age, or over the age of 59 and a half. Basically, you can withdraw them without the 10% penalty and completely tax-free. And then if you're a business owner, so if you invest in real estate and if real estate investing is your primary, your primary focus and your career, there are IRAs designed specifically for self-employed individuals or those who own a business. The SEP, simple, and qualified plans. Those typically are a little bit different because they offer you the ability to contribute more out of pocket into your IRA, where typically the traditional and the Roth are only going to let you deposit $6,000 or $7,000 per year, depending on your age. Like if you wanted to pull money out of your checking or savings and stash it into your IRA. But with these employer types of plans and IRAs, you have greater potential to take money that you're earning from your employment and put away a percentage up to a larger amount. And then the other two that aren't technically retirement accounts, but also have lots of tax advantages and can be self-directed are the education savings account and the health savings account. So any withdrawals from these accounts for education or medical expenses, respectively, would be tax-free withdrawals. And so you can fund one, you can put it in, you can invest in real estate or any private investments that we talked about, and then you can withdraw those for your child's education or your own medical expenses. In terms of getting cash into the newly created self-directed IRA, there are a number of ways you can do that to get started. So we just talked about contributions, so that's taking money out of pocket and then depositing it into your retirement account. If you have existing IRAs with other custodians like the Fidelities or Morgan Stanleys of the world, for example, and they do not offer real estate investments or other private alternative investments, then you can actually take a portion or all of those funds from your other IRA, and they can be transferred from that custodian to your self-directed IRA custodian. And then you would have that cash to deploy into real estate or other alternative investments. If you have an old employer plan, like an old 401k, and we're seeing lots of that now because of the pandemic, people left their jobs or people decided to start their own businesses. So there's a lot of movement there with these old employer plans now kind of just hanging out, not doing anything. So think about that if you're in a situation where either you or someone you know has recently left a job. You would then be eligible to roll those funds over into a self-directed IRA and keep them actively invested in something so they're going to continue to earn you money rather than once you leave the company, they just kind of sit there and don't do anything. And then, of course, there's also the option, we talked about the Roth being really powerful. If that's something that you're thinking about, but you have retirement funds in a non-Roth account, you can do what's called a conversion and you can move them from that non-Roth into the Roth. It's a taxable event for the year that you do that. And then once it's in the Roth, of course, it grows tax-free, as we mentioned before. So there are a number of things to consider, not only what you want to invest in, but what type of account do you want to establish if you're going to be self-directing, and then how do you plan on funding your account. So a lot of times we get questions about the mechanics of this. Like, okay, so I can use my IRA to invest in real estate. How does that work? Like, do I take it out of my IRA and then I invest it and then I put it back in? Or how do I do this in a compliant way? So the way that it works is if you were to take the money out yourself and then invest it in real estate, it's going to create a taxable event, right? Because anytime you withdraw funds from a retirement account, it gets reported to the IRS. And the idea behind this is not doing that, is not creating a taxable event. So how this works is you go through your custodian as that middleman for the transaction. So you set up your self-directed IRA, you choose your investment, you direct your custodian to take the funds out of your IRA on behalf of you and deploy them into the investment that you've identified. And then, so the funds leave your IRA and they go into that investment. You don't touch them at all during that process. Now, once that investment starts to earn a return, whether you're selling property, you're getting paid dividends, you're being repaid principal and interest, whatever it is that's going to generate a return, those funds are then going to flow back directly into your IRA. So any payments made payable to the IRA, not to you personally. So by doing that, you're keeping that flow. It's like a closed loop system. You're not taking anything out for yourself. You're putting everything back directly into the IRA, and thus it remains tax sheltered. So I mentioned this now just because we typically tend to get a lot of questions about that, and it's not always clear what role everyone plays in this process. So that's how the funds would flow with a self-directed IRA. So let's talk about investing in real estate. Obviously, the options are not limited to real estate, but this is a huge area of interest, and it does probably make up the lion's share of assets that are held in self-directed IRAs, probably just because of the popularity and relatability of real estate. But even within the realm of real estate, there's so much that you can do with a self-directed IRA. So you can directly purchase property, whether you buy it outright with cash in your IRA, and your IRA then becomes the sole owner of the property, and then the property was titled and deeded to the IRA. If you don't have enough cash to buy a property outright, which is often the case, you can finance it. You would have to obtain, if you have an IRA and you're going to leverage property, a non-recourse loan if you were going to actually get a mortgage. The non-recourse loan is a little bit different than a typical mortgage because it's going to require that the only leverage the lender has, if you default, is to foreclose on the property itself. So the only collateral that they have is the asset itself that's being leveraged. No other assets could be taken from the IRA or from the owner of the IRA in association with the loan, which is a little bit more risky, obviously, for the lender. So they typically require more money down. And a lot of times they require a cash flowing property. But of course, every lender has their own terms. So if that's something that someone is looking at doing, it's best to contact those lenders and have a conversation with them. Another option, which often comes up as well, if someone decides, I don't want to deal with the non-recourse loan, it's not the right choice for me, is if you don't have enough cash on your own, you can partner with another buyer or multiple buyers. So you can essentially form like a JV in which your IRA takes some ownership of the property and then other partners are going in with you. The IRA has a percentage of ownership. It's going to earn its return related to that percentage. And then of course, any expenses associated with its ownership would come out of the IRA. So this can be done for properties to flip or properties to hold. Of course, if you're flipping, it's more of a short-term investment. So once you sell that property, proceeds from sale go back into the IRA. And at that point, you have all this cash, yay, and you decide what you want to do next, which could be reinvesting it in another flip, investing it in another alternative asset, something different within your self-directed IRA, or you could decide, I want to go back to traditional investing and put it back in my Fidelity IRA and go back into the market, and you can do that with your nice chunk of change. If you're buying and holding, obviously it's typically more of a long-term play. So you're going to take your rental income and you're going to have that passive income flowing into your IRA on hopefully a monthly basis. So we talked about partnering as it's pretty popular. There's also obviously so even within partnering, there are probably different levels to that, right? Because if we're talking about commercial real estate, we can be talking about syndications, we can be talking about crowdfunding, and all of those approaches are doable here. I know we're not talking as much about Mill Creek today, but I know from having conversations with Spencer and Parker that part of the offering that Mill Creek has is the ability to take a portion of ownership of commercial real estate. So that's something that the IRA could do. It doesn't mean investing in commercial real estate doesn't mean that you have to have millions of dollars in your IRA. There are other ways to get involved in a more passive manner.
Yeah, just to put some color on there, Brittany, we offer what's called a tenant in common interest. And so, let's say we have a $2 million building. Someone can come in with a 1031 exchange. They can buy 400,000. The next person, 400,000 of cash. The next person, 150, 272,000, whatever the amount is out of their IRA. And their IRA is on title, has a deeded interest in that property. And now they have in their portfolio an asset that's really high quality, maybe a long-term lease, right? Lots of stability, but they own just a small portion of it.
Right. And then they're not having to do all of the
like residential landlord
work. That comes with managing something of that size. Yeah, so that's a great fit for a self-directed IRA because we're going to talk about some of the rules and regulations now. It's a perfect segue. Thank you. And typically ideal scenario for a self-directed IRA is a passive arm's length transaction type of investment where you're not actively having to manage it. So the IRS does have some restrictions when it comes to how IRAs can invest. They define them as prohibited transactions, and these are types of transactions that would take place between a self-directed IRA and what they define as a disqualified person. So I'm going to skip ahead real quick and show you what would be considered a disqualified person from an IRA. So if you're thinking about yourself and imagine that you have a self-directed IRA and you want to understand who would be disqualified from my self-directed IRA, from transacting with my IRA. These relationships here would be disqualified. So you yourself, if it's your IRA, so you personally can't do transactions with your own IRA, like lending to yourself or lending money to your IRA or buying something with your IRA that you personally own. So it would have to be a new investment. Same thing with your spouse, any ascendants, descendants, or their spouses, if you think about your family line and in like a lineal direction. And then of course, anyone that's servicing your account that might have a conflict of interest. So like a financial advisor, your custodian, obviously, and then any entities or companies that are 50% or more owned by a combination of these disqualified people. So like a family-owned business or even a business that maybe one of your parents half owns or something like that. That would be off limits for your IRA. So I'm going to go back and define the three types of prohibited transactions now that we understand disqualified persons. So the first one is exactly what I had mentioned per se. It's just the exchange between a IRA and a disqualified person can't be done. The second one is an extension of credit. So that's any lending between an IRA and a disqualified person that cannot be done, whether it's on the lending or the borrowing side, in either direction. And this is one of the reasons why if an IRA needs a mortgage, that it has to be a non-recourse loan because personal guarantees are not permitted when self-directed IRAs are involved. And then the third one, which is called self-dealing by the IRS, is a little bit more gray area. And this is where sometimes things can be open to interpretation and when either the custodian needs to come in to make a determination, or even sometimes an attorney may need to get involved to make a determination on whether something is prohibited or not. This usually comes into play where it's not blatant that someone is involved in the transaction, but maybe they're involved somewhere behind the scenes where they're getting an indirect benefit from the investment, from the IRA's investment. So an example might be, let's say that you use your self-directed IRA to invest in a private company and you don't own it. So that means that's okay. It's not a per se prohibited transaction. So you can invest in the company. However, you are providing consulting services to the company on the side and you're getting paid. So that could potentially be a prohibited transaction as a double benefit because your IRA is investing in the company and then its performance is going to pay back your IRA as part of the investment. And then you're also possibly adding some value to it as well for your personal consulting services, for which you're also being personally compensated. So when it starts to get a little bit more complex is where we need to look at that as a possibility. So I just wanted to cover this so that if anyone has ideas in mind of something that they're looking to do, that they're sort of checking against these regulations first to see whether or not it would be doable in a self-directed IRA.
Brittany, it's interesting that I can do a transaction with my in-laws, right? With my wife's parents.
Right.
But I cannot do them with my own parents.
Right. And you could also do transactions with your siblings.
Yes.
Cousins, aunts, or uncles, because as I had mentioned earlier, the relationships that are disqualified are that up and down direction. So if you think about relationships laterally, for whatever reason, they are not considered disqualified persons. So I'm glad you brought that up because it isn't, it shouldn't be an assumption that just because you have a relationship to someone, like a family relationship, that it's off the table. It's just a matter of what type of relationship is it. So yes, you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Okay, so we talked about prohibited transactions conceptually, and I like to sometimes provide more concrete examples to put this in perspective. So when it comes to investing in real estate, and especially since we're talking about commercial real estate today, if you're using your IRA to invest and you're doing a syndication, for example, or some sort of crowdfunding, you're investing as a limited partner in a larger entity, perhaps. You cannot personally be an active partner, director, or managing member of that entity. So that level of control would not be permitted if you were going to use your IRA to invest. You can't be a general partner, you have to be a limited partner. The other thing, which we kind of covered, but just to reiterate, that the investment earnings cannot be paid directly back to you personally. And if you wanted to take the earnings that you've generated through your IRA and you wanted to take them out eventually and start to use them personally, you can do that, but you have to follow the proper channels. So the investment return still has to flow first back into your IRA. And then because it's your IRA, of course, you are entitled to take a distribution anytime that you like. It's a matter of, okay, at that time, how old are you? Are you going to incur an early 10% penalty if you take it early? Depending on the account type you have, what would be the tax implications when you do decide to take your distribution? But I just put this here to emphasize not to assume that just because it's your IRA's investment, that you can just take money directly out of the investment and pay it back to yourself. It still has to flow through the IRA first. And then the other one that's pretty common that I want to mention is sweat equity. So obviously, if you're personally invested in real estate, you're free to go into the property and do your own repairs and make your own upgrades, use your own contracting company. But when you are using a self-directed IRA, you're not permitted to do those things. So any repairs or any work on the property would have to be done by either a contractor, property management company, or a non-disqualified person that can do it. So this doesn't typically tend to come up when we talk about commercial real estate, because most people that are investing in commercial real estate are not planning to actively manage the property. But I do mention it just as an aside because it is important to understand that it is not permitted. So I have just a few more here. We don't have to go over every single one, but I did want to just emphasize the most important ones. Probably the biggest one that we see happen is when someone calls us and says, I'm looking at this property, I'm in the middle of this deal, and I want to put it in my IRA, and we're closing in 2 weeks, and I already put down a deposit, and I need to move fast. And we're like, okay, unfortunately, probably a little late to the game on that one. So the issue with that becomes, well, there are a number of issues with waiting until you are in the process of acquiring a property to then put it in the IRA. One is that if the IRA is going to purchase this property, then everything has to be done through the IRA from the beginning. So putting down a deposit personally or personally signing a contract and then trying to transfer it, it's technically a prohibited transaction, because if you are taking something from your personal name and transferring it to your IRA, that exchange was one of the issues that we mentioned earlier. It's also an issue because putting down that deposit personally is giving your IRA the advantage over other potential buyers to acquire and secure that property. So by personally providing an advantage to the IRA, it's also sort of a self-dealing prohibited transaction. So typically, this is here to emphasize the importance of being proactive about setting up a self-directed IRA. And there's this fine line between, you don't want to wait so long that you're up against a deadline to try and rush and get your IRA set up and get the money over and get, the documents reviewed, and that can take several weeks. And we're going to talk about that in a moment. But then you, of course, also don't want to just dump a bunch of cash in a self-directed IRA and not have an investment in mind on the horizon, because it won't really do you any favors sitting there while you're waiting. So typically what I suggest is, if you have investments in mind and it's sort of a matter of, I'm just waiting for the next investment, I'm waiting for the right opportunity, but when I find it, I'm going to do this with my IRA. Then that's a time at which it would be good to start taking the steps to establish the account, think about how you're going to fund your IRA, talk to the custodian about what you're planning, have a good conversation so you understand what you can and cannot do in that investment, and then also make sure that they're setting expectations with you as far as the timelines to expect what your role is in the process. Because you will be, with a self-directed IRA, you will be somewhat more involved. Because again, this isn't usually a situation where you have an advisor that's just handling everything for you. That's one of the beauties of this, is you have that control and the decision-making power, but then it also means that you just have the responsibility to make sure that you are not putting yourself in a situation to jeopardize your investment opportunity or your IRA, of course.
So Brittany, here's a question for you. If we can play like the what if game, right? What if you use your self-directed retirement account to purchase investment real estate, and that investment real estate is at a distance from you? Maybe it would require a plane ride, a flight to go and visit the property, right? Because as you can go visit the property, you just can't do any work on it, correct?
Correct.
So if you're buying a flight, 2 states over, and does the IRA purchase those flights, or do you purchase those flights personally? Because here it says, cannot use any personal funds to cover expenses if property is owned by, inside your IRA.
Yeah, that's a really good question. My first inclination is to say that it's not something that the IRA would be expected to pay for in that case.
Yeah.
If you think about just regular day-to-day sort of like oversight of a property, we don't consider that to be sweat equity.
Got it. Okay.
Just as if you were going to screen your own tenants and do background checks and that sort of thing. You're allowed to do those things. You're just not allowed to do anything that's going to directly add value to the property itself.
Right.
So that would be my response.
Good insight.
But
Thank
it
you.
never hurts to double check with an ERISA attorney on some of these things too, if there are like very specific scenarios.
Mhm.
Because as long as we've been doing this, there's always something new that comes up we've never heard of before.
Right.
Never a dull moment with self-directed IRA.
Right.
That's why it's good also to have a good network of resources in your arsenal, like a good tax advisor, that understands self-directed IRAs, a good attorney that understands these rules and regs, because not all attorneys have a specialization in this space. And then, of course, a good custodian to provide you the guidance and the oversight and whatnot. So, great question, though. I don't know that anyone's ever asked me that before.
So, Brittany, we have a couple questions here. So let's hit that last slide, and then let's jump into questions and start answering questions.
Perfect. Okay, let's do it. So naturally, after all this, usually the next question is, if I wanted to do this, how do I get started and what's the process? So the first step in the process is establishing a new IRA, a self-directed IRA with your chosen custodian. And that would require completing an application to open the IRA. We do everything through DocuSign now to try to make it as easy and streamlined as possible. And of course, there's, as with any financial institution, there's a level of security required to access and enter information, and there's an ID check that has to be run. But essentially, it's just filling out an application, which takes 1 to 2 business days to process. So then once the account's open, you're typically going to receive a welcome email and a call. You should receive a call from your custodian to confirm the account is open, and then you're going to discuss next steps, which are going to be funding your new account. So the funding, as we discussed earlier, the methods would be either contribution, a rollover, a transfer, or a conversion. So depending on what you've discussed and agreed on, then there's going to be some documentation for you to fill out to get the funds moved over from your other institution. So the custodian will work with you through that process and send out any requests from their end that they're required to send. Now that process can literally take anywhere from a few days to a couple of weeks, I usually say. This is the most frustrating part of the process sometimes, because there's another institution that's holding your funds and they're probably not thrilled about sending them away. So we have to be as diligent and as efficient as we can to make sure that we are following and meeting their requirements for them to let go of your funds, so that they don't have any delays in processing or any reasons to hold back the funds. So once the funds are moved over into your account, then you're ready to make your investment. And the investment process is going to require more documentation, because every alternative investment is unique and different. So depending on what you're investing in, we're going to let you know what types of documentation we need. It's going to be supporting documentation for the investment. So if you think of, imagine if you were going to do it with your personal funds and what you would typically sign in your own name, those same documents we're going to need to have, but we're going to sign them on behalf of your IRA for you once you have reviewed and approved them. So, and we're also, during that process, reviewing the documents to make sure that your IRA is labeled appropriately. We don't see anything that would be a blatant prohibited transaction. If we did see something like that, we wouldn't process the investment. We don't want to jeopardize your IRA. And then, of course, we're doing sort of like an administrative and compliance review on that. And then there's going to be a direction of investment that you're going to submit, which is an internal form to tell us, direct us to take your funds out of your account, and you're going to tell us how much money you want sent out, where you want it sent, wire instructions if the funds are wired, or if you're sending a check. Every single direction comes from you, and then we carry out that direction on behalf of your account. So all in all, the process can take 4 to 6 weeks even. So that's why we do say, think ahead, try to be proactive, even get the account open. Even if you don't plan on funding the account immediately, you can still open it and then fund it within the next, couple of months when you find a deal. That's fine. But at least you're saving yourself the time going through that whole first step, and you're ahead of the game when it comes time to actually make an investment.
So I think like two key points here. Number one, you're able to help people set up their account. If they're coming from an employer that had a retirement account with them, you can help transition them out of the custodian their employer was using, right, to help fund their self-directed retirement account.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then number two, you're just kind of there every step of the way, helping and assisting and providing, education and that sort of thing, just to kind of, hold their hand, because for a lot of people this is new.
Exactly. Yeah. You mentioned earlier, which I appreciated, that we have a big emphasis on customer service.
Oh yeah.
I want to reemphasize that, because especially with self-directed IRAs and the way that this business model in general just works, there's so much more like personal involvement that has to be done here. This isn't like you go online and press a button and trade a stock, right? Because again, every investment is unique and different in the non-public space. So there is a lot more personal touch, personal service that has to be provided. And you're right, there are a lot of investors that are new to this strategy. So especially when you're giving someone your money to hold and investments to manage for you, you want to feel that you can get responses to your questions relatively quickly, that you can easily get in touch with a live person, that you're working with people that are going to guide you through the process and make sure that they're doing everything to keep the process streamlined. So yes, that is extremely important when looking at custodians. We are not one of the largest by any means, and nor do I think we want to be. We like that we're sort of a boutique type of firm because we're able to maintain that type of customer service that we feel is really important to be successful in the space.
Well, Brittany, thank you so much. And we have lots of questions, but before we dive into the questions, if you have any questions, insert those in the Q&A feature. We'd love to hear from you. I think we'll be able to get to all of them. And then number two, a recording of this webinar will be emailed out to all of those that have registered. It will also be live on our website, millcreekcommercial.com. Brittany, will it be live on yours?
It will. We will have it available on demand in our webinar library at nextgenerationtrust.com. So there are all the webinars we've done, and this one you can click on and then just download the recording or access it via YouTube. It'll be on YouTube. Perfect.
Okay, so Mark asks our first question. Okay, well, what about cryptocurrency? Cryptocurrency is it's like all the rage.
Never ask.
and there's like a new crypto showing up every week. So what about cryptocurrency?
Yeah, this is talk of the past month or couple months. This is like all the rage. So yes, cryptocurrency can be held in IRAs. There are essentially two different ways that can be done. And it's funny because we literally just did a webinar on cryptocurrency last week. So that can also be downloaded from our website. The one way that you can do it is you can set up what's called an IRA LLC. So essentially you have your self-directed IRA, you then establish a newly formed LLC with IRA as the member, and then the IRA funds the LLC's business checking account. So you can then use that business checking account to set up a digital wallet with like the Coinbases and the Geminis of the world and any other exchange that you choose. And then you can sort of like self-manage it that way.
Yeah.
The other way to do it is it is what I guess I would call like a direct custody option. So you don't need an LLC to do it. You open up your self-directed IRA. As long as your custodian has some sort of a relationship with a third party that can hold crypto, then what you would do is you would work through your custodian to set up a crypto account with that third party. And then the custodian would deploy the funds from your account to the crypto exchange. That's the third party that they're using. And then you would work directly with the crypto exchange to buy, sell, trade, anything. And then that would be like a closed loop system. So I can't speak for all custodians, but we do have both of those options available.
Good. Okay, so Locke asks about your custodian fees. And I want to kind of focus this on what are the custodian fees you charge for holding real estate in your self-directed retirement account if you're the custodian, and then kind of on the other side of that coin, can those fees be paid out of pocket? In other words, does the SDIRA have to fund those fees, or can you just pay it out of pocket? So
sure. I'll answer the easier part of that question first, which is the fees can be paid either out of pocket or deducted from the IRA's cash balance. So it's just a matter of preference. You can pay with a check or credit card, or you can just put some extra cash if you want to buffer in your IRA, and it could be pulled from there. So the fees themselves are going to be primarily custodial and transaction fees. So because we're not financial advisors, we don't charge like a percentage of what you make or anything like that. It's strictly tied to the service we provide. The custodial fee, we offer two options. One is a flat rate per asset. So that would be, for example, if you're invested in one real estate, if you're invested in one property, that's considered an asset that your IRA owns. So there would be a flat annual fee that you would pay. The second option is based on the overall value of your IRA, regardless of the number of investments. So we just look at what's the funding amount, or what's your IRA worth, and then associated with that, there's a quarterly fee. So no matter what you do, you'll always have a custodial fee that you're responsible for if you're holding an IRA, self-directed IRA. Then the transaction fees are just going to be driven by your investment activity. So when you're purchasing your first asset, for example, there's a transaction fee for the custodian to process that for you. That's going to cover the review I mentioned earlier, the administrative review on your investment. And then it's going to cover them processing the transaction itself. And then the same thing would apply at the conclusion of your investment. There'd be a liquidation and then be a transaction fee for that liquidation. There are other fees which may or may not apply. A lot of times with self-directed IRAs, there are fees that are conditional depending on what activity is taking place in the account. So it's best to check our fee schedule. I can either send it out following our webinar, or it's also available on our website under the forms page. So it's easily accessible. And then, of course, if anyone has any questions, I'm sure my contact information will be out.
Good, thank you. William asked a unique question, and I think this is, well, something to think about. So he asked, can you use more than one retirement account on the same property? And then he goes on to say, can my wife and I both use our separate retirement accounts to own the same property?
Great question, William. Yes. So the answers to both of those questions are yes. If you have multiple IRAs, like for example, we have clients that might have a traditional IRA and then a Roth IRA. So they don't want to necessarily put all the traditional funds into their Roth. They want to keep them separate, but they want to use both of them for one investment. You can do that, but essentially those IRAs have to be treated as if they're disqualified persons from each other. So what you can actually do is you could partner them into an investment. Like each of them is a separate partner. Each of them has a separate percentage of ownership of the property. And then the expenses and income are split. Like if it was a 70-30 split, for example, the one IRA would get 70% of the income, the other IRA would get 30%. So that can definitely be done. And the same exact guidelines and requirements would apply if someone and their spouse were going to go in on one together, because spouses are considered, we mentioned earlier, disqualified persons. However, if you're partnering where you're not commingling, but you're just pooling your funds into the same investment, then that works. And you just follow those same rules. You have to keep things separate for the ownership percentages, but that can also be done. And it's actually a pretty popular way to go. So
good, thank you. Okay, so John asked, so if an LLC is 51% owned by an outside partner, and I'm going to say an outside partner is not a,
qualified person.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yes, would I be able to invest my cash along with solo 401k money to make up the other 49%? In other words, maybe his 401k or a self-directed brings in 25% and his own cash brings in, what would that be, 24%?
Yeah, definitely. You can partner. That's another good question that has the same applicable guidelines to what I just described. So in situations where you want to use a combination of personal funds and a self-directed account, same strategy of like that partnering idea applies, even though you are disqualified from your self-directed, if it's a solo K, for example. Yes, you can put both of them into the investment, but again, remember that it has to be funded at the same time, so that you're not doing anything that's going to alter the ownership percentage of one later. So you have to just decide up front, what percentage is the account going to own, what percentage am I going to own, and then go in simultaneously into that.
Okay, so Matthew asks, this is regarding to sweat equity. What if he's performing work on the real estate projects that is owned by his self-directed retirement account, but he is not being compensated for any of the work provided?
Good question. Unfortunately, even if you're not being financially compensated, the IRS doesn't allow you to even do physical work. They seem to see that as a contribution. Like, as if, think about if you put cash into your IRA, right? You make a contribution, you add value to it. If you are physically, personally doing repairs on the property that's going to increase the value of the asset, then they see that as like a personal contribution, but contributions can only be made in cash. So they don't allow it. So even if you're not paying yourself, you wouldn't be allowed to perform the physical repairs. You'd have to use a contractor, property management company, or a non-disqualified person.
So you could go, so for example, if your property needed a new water heater, you could go to Home Depot, buy the water heater with your self-directed IRA funds, and then take it to the home, but the plumber will need to install that. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yes. Is that like, so you can oversee the admin of the property.
Yes.
You can call, if it needs new sod, you can call a sod company and organize the delivery of it. You just cannot do the installation of that sod, of that water heater, or whatever the case may be.
Right, exactly. You can assess the property. You can make any decisions related to that property, as far as hiring or evaluating contractors, negotiating price, selecting the products or materials. Any of those like intangible things you can do. But then when it comes to actually installing or painting or, replacing things, then that has to be done by someone else.
Like, you cannot even put a single nail in a wall.
Technically, no.
Right.
The IRS doesn't really, they're not very forgiving when it comes to that.
Okay, so Larry asked, so a self-directed Roth purchases a portion of an LLC that the self-directed owner is a member of. Would that be considered disqualified?
If it was owned 100% by that person, yes, because if the Roth IRA were then going to invest, that would mean that it would be buying out a portion of your ownership, which is a prohibited transaction because it's an exchange between a disqualified person and an IRA. Yeah. However, if you wanted to fund a new LLC where you partner in and your IRA partners in at the same time, then that's okay. But if you already have the ownership, then it's too late to like give some of it or transfer some of it to the IRA.
Okay, so Michael asks, so if I sold the property, and I'm assuming Michael is, saying that this property is owned inside of his self-directed retirement account. So if I sold the property and I'm the realtor, the profit of the sale goes to the IRA. That makes sense. But could he, because he's a realtor, get a commission legally for selling that asset?
If it's his or her self-directed IRA, then no, you cannot pay yourself a commission. You can be the realtor, you can represent your property on a sale or purchase, but you cannot pay yourself. That's self-dealing.
All that commission would go in the form of profit back to the IRA account, correct?
Correct.
If you had an outside agent, an unrelated, a non-disqualified person, you could pay them a real estate commission, right?
Yes, they could be paid a commission, but not.
You just can't pay
yourself or any disqualified person.
Yeah, disqualified person. Yeah. Okay, good. Okay, so this is from Becky. So were you saying if I buy a single family house as an investment property, I cannot do anything as far as being the one to rent it out myself? I would have to hire a management company then? Question mark.
So this is sort of what we discussed a couple of questions ago. I don't know, Becky, if we answered this for you. So you don't have to hire a property management company. You're not required to. You're just not permitted to do those physical repairs and the physical work yourself. But if you don't have a property management company, you can just hire contractors to do it. But you are allowed to like select tenants, you list your property for rent or for sale. You can, again, if you're looking at tenants, for example, I just keep going back to that because there's a lot of like management type of work in that. You can screen them, you can do background checks, you can negotiate your lease agreement, you know, all of those things. You can collect rents if you are collecting rent yourself, but then the rents have to be paid to the IRA. So hopefully that clears it up. Does that answer it? You think?
Yeah.
Answer it?
I think that's good.
Okay.
Matthew circles back to ask, if you buy development land with your SDIRA, can you also pay related expenses from it? And I'm assuming from the retirement account, i.e. annual property taxes, engineering, development, all the costs to entitle it, all that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it would have to. If you bought like a parcel of undeveloped or raw land with your IRA, then and it owns 100% of it, then all the expenses associated with that would have to come out of the IRA. So taxes, maintenance, repairs, insurance, all of those expenses that you would typically think of. Yes.
None of those expenses could come out of pocket.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Unless you partnered where like you own half of it personally and your IRA owned half of it, then you split the expense.
You split.
But if your IRA wholly owns it, then the expenses have to come from the IRA. Correct.
Good. Okay. So, I think we got through most of these questions here. An anonymous attendee asks, how will this be protected from the government? And can the SDIRA be held in an account outside the U.S.?
So, the second part of that question, technically, an IRA is going to be a U.S. based retirement account. So it's always going to be held by a custodian in the United States. However, if it's possible that if someone lives abroad, they could have a self-directed IRA if they have US income and a tax ID number. So we do have clients in other countries that have self-directed IRAs. So hopefully that answers that. And in terms of being protected by the government, I'm not quite sure what that is asking. Is it asking, are the investments themselves protected? I would need to get a little bit more clarification on that one.
Okay, Jonathan asks, are you able to invest in traditional IRA equities while you are waiting for a real estate transaction that fits your underwriting criteria?
Good question. I get that question a lot too. So generally speaking, if you have cash that's not invested, it'll just sit. It's not earning anything. There are some options. For example, we have a sub-account option with TD Ameritrade. So if someone really thought it might be a while before they deploy their cash into an investment, they could establish the TD Ameritrade sub-account and shift their cash into that. It's still technically under the self-directed IRA, but the cash could then be shifted into that, like almost like a brokerage account, so that they could put it into money market or something. We get that question a lot, just so it's earning something. Mm-hmm. And then when they identify an investment, it's a little bit quicker to move it from the sub account back into the next gen portion versus if you're holding it out at Fidelity and you're trying to move it in from that institution quickly, that could be a little bit more challenging. So technically that's an option. But usually we're seeing that it's not a long period of time that someone's going to have cash in there before they're going to deploy it out into a new investment.
Yeah. So on one of your slides, you talked about under certain criteria, you can use leverage, you can use debt along with your self-directed retirement account. And that type of loan is a unique loan. It's a non-recourse loan.
Correct.
Basically, and you said this, what that means is the only recourse the financial institution has if you default is to go after and foreclose on the property and sell that property, and hopefully they get all their money back
Mhm.
to cover that loan. So I want to just shed and maybe shed some light and highlight one strategy that could be useful for a lot of self-directed retirement account owners who want real estate, but maybe didn't know how they could use their account to get into commercial real estate, and maybe don't really want to like full-time manage a fourplex or a duplex or something that requires a lot of admin time, right? And so we have a product. It's a CVS, like the pharmacy, right? We love CVS. They sign long-term leases. They're on high quality real estate corners, busy corners of the county, high visibility. They sign a single, well, they're a single tenant building. Most of them are, a lot of them are, but they also sign a triple net lease, which means that they handle all maintenance, broken window, clogged toilet. They pay property taxes, they pay insurance, right? And so, in terms of like the definition of passive income and like zero landlording responsibility, a CVS is a really good example. And so CVS has financing on these deals, and it amortizes over the initial lease term, 25 years. And so, and it's a non-recourse loan. And because it's a non-recourse loan, they don't really care who is on the hook for the loan because CVS guarantees the loan payment. And so what someone could do is okay, let's say they had like $400,000 in their retirement account and they want real estate, but they want maybe something higher quality than like a duplex, right? Well, they could come over with $250,000, bring that over to one of our CVS projects. The LTV is right around 75%, 74%, or 76%, something like that. And they could bring in $250,000 and essentially buy $1 million share of the CVS, enjoy all the benefits of that long-term lease, that high quality tenant. They paid rent every month during COVID, so it can be a really good play. And at the end of 20 years, 25 years, however long that lease is, now they own that $1 million share in that building debt free, because the rents pay off the mortgage in their initial lease term. So it's a way they can really leverage up, own real estate, own commercial real estate, and not really have to manage with the day-to-day admin of a duplex or a fourplex that, quite frankly, could be more trouble than they're worth until they're retired, right? So just wanted to just shed some light on that perhaps that could be a good fit for someone looking for real estate but they also don't really have to work a whole lot to manage it. Hey, sorry, Brittany, speak up a little bit louder. We couldn't quite hear you.
No problem. So technically, a portion of that CVS, for example, is then titled to their IRA directly.
Exactly. So if it's a $4 million CVS, they would own, the deed would say that their retirement account owns 25% of that building. Right. Together with, knowing that every rent dollar collected is going to pay down that mortgage. So it doesn't cash flow, but at the end of the initial lease term, the loans have been all paid off.
Right. Okay. Yeah. That's a good idea. That's a good option.
Well, okay. So that basically wraps up all of our Q&A. Brittany, thank you so much for joining us today. Just, is there anything you want to leave with us as we kind of wrap up and say goodbye? Any I don't know, any words of wisdom you want to share with us?
I would just say that if someone's thinking about what to do next, this is a journey to get educated. I wouldn't expect that anyone would know everything that they need to know after a 1-hour webinar on this topic. So certainly continue to educate yourselves. Our website, if it would help, is a great resource for more education. There is, as I mentioned, a library of tons of webinars, including the one on crypto for that person that asked. There are white papers that are published on prohibited transactions that go into more detail about that, real estate investing ideas, some case studies, things that other clients have done that have been really creative and unique. And then, of course, there are a lot of ways to get in touch if you feel that you're ready to speak to a person. You can call the office live and call the office and speak with a live person immediately. You can also on the website schedule a consultation with someone from my team that you can pick a time that works for your calendar. We also have a text feature through the site if you wanted to just text someone when you're on the go. So there are lots of ways to get in touch and just spark a conversation. So I encourage you all to continue the journey, and I hope you got something valuable out of today.
Brittany, what's your website address?
It's www.nextgenerationtrust.com.
And what's a good phone number if someone wants to reach out to you? What's a good phone number and what's a good email?
So I'll put it in the chat if I can here. Let's see, do I have the option to? Yes. So it's going to be 973. Actually, you know what? Let me give you our toll-free 888-857-8058. And then the best email address so that you get a response from someone and see someone is out is a new accounts at nextgenerationtrust.com that goes to my whole team, including myself, just so we can be sure whoever's available gets in touch as soon as possible.
Brittany, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure. Great conversation. Great questions too. I really appreciate that from the audience.
And to all of those who have joined us, thank you so much. We sure appreciate it. Reminder that this webinar will be on demand, available on our website, millcreekcommercial.com. If you have any questions for us at Mill Creek Commercial, our phone number is 801-899-1943. Thank you. And if anyone needs to hear this webinar, we hope you share it with them. Thanks again. Have a good day.
Have a great day.